Hello, everyone. Welcome to the April online chapter meeting of the Building Designers Association of Australia. My name is Jennifer Binns and I'm a building designer based in Tasmania and host for the online chapter meetings. I'm joined by Sarah Jane, managing technology in the background. Please post us a message in the chat where you are logging in from. It's great to see so many people joining us. We have lots of events on this month, both formal and informal, paid and free. Sarah Jane is going to post some links in the chat box if you want to register or need any more information. First up is Crossing the Threshold to Accessible Housing, which is now running for the 4th time due to popular demand. I've done this workshop myself and can highly recommend it. If you haven't been able to attend previously because it was held during the day, it is now an evening event. It starts on the 13th of April and is run over 2 sessions per week for 3 weeks. Then we have Paul Ha from Ha Architecture presenting Mullum Creek. You may have come across this peri-urban eco-housing development in Don Vale, Victoria. It has drawn considerable interest among Australian building professionals by eliciting processes and outcomes that go well beyond and address weaknesses in what is generally being considered best practice sustainable development. This event is free and is worth 1 formal CPD point or 1 Category 1 CPD point. Towards the end of the month, we have the new conversation about condensation. As we continue on our journey to a future of sustainable building, the ever-present question of condensation management has slowly moved up the agenda. Failure to understand, adapt and address the risk of condensation poses direct threats to the quality of structures we build and the health of occupants, which is why now more than ever, it is important to have a new conversation about condensation. Andy Russell is presenting a 6-part session, which is worth 6 formal CPD points for designers, and thermal performance assessors will earn 1 Category 1 CPD point for knowledge in relation to NCC and 2 Category 2 points for attending the event in relation to industry knowledge. As a BDAA member, besides the education, advocacy, networking and national awards, you receive discounted rates to all paid events. So if you're considering becoming a member, after attending 2 or 3 paid events, the savings would have paid for your membership. Sarah Jane is going to put a link in the chat box if you would like to find out more about joining the BDAA. And a reminder also that all of the national online chapter events are recorded and loaded into the BDAA members only area of the website for you to rewatch at any time. And hello to everyone that's putting those messages in the chat box, it's great. So today we have 2 fantastic speakers, Tim Washington from Jet Charge and Michael Smith from Kingspan. A big welcome to Tim and Michael. Before we get started with the presentations, a quick run through of the Zoom tools. You're welcome to ask questions throughout the meeting and we welcome you to ask questions using the Q&A box, and our presenters will answer the questions either throughout the presentation if they're able to or at the end. If you'd like to ask a question via audio, there's the raise your hand tool, and we just ask that you check there's no background noise that will interfere with the audio when we unmute you to ask your question. And the chat box is there as a continuous message thread for comments, and SJ will post links into the chat box. So the first presentation today is sustainable buildings. I'm just checking, is that still what we're doing, SJ?
No, actually, Tim Washington is here and we're looking forward to hearing from him now.
Right, okay. So the first presentation is electric vehicle charging, designing for the future of transport. CEO and founder of Jet Charge, Tim Washington, will guide you through the practicalities of specifying EV charging infrastructure in modern buildings. He'll go through historical trends and modern day best practice and will offer a glimpse of what the future holds for building and refueling of vehicles. So have I got you online, Tim?
Yes.
Great.
Hi, everyone.
I'm going to hand over to you. Welcome. All yours.
Thank you. Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Tim. It's great to be with you today. I'm just going to share my screen. Let me just see if I can do this properly. Let me know if you can see that.
Yes, we can see that.
Okay, great. All right, so hi everyone, my name is Tim Washington. I'm the CEO of Jet Charge. We're Australia's largest EV charging infrastructure provider, and I just want to have a chat with you guys about EV charging and best practice for building design. It won't be very technical. Today what I was hoping to do was to run through the concepts, and if you have any specific questions, obviously happy to answer that. I'm also a co-founder and director of ChargeFox, which is the largest EV charging network in Australia. Think about it like a kind of a new age petrol station chain. And I also sit as the chair of the Electric Vehicle Council, which is the peak body for the electric vehicle industry in Australia. So if you have any questions around policy, government action, all of that, I can hopefully answer that as well. Okay, so let me just kind of set the context. A lot of people ask me, when do you think EVs are going to take off? And there's a lot of different answers to that around price parity, all of that stuff. But really the key is not so much like what year in particular EVs are going to take off, but whether or not we're prepared for the rate of take up. And the universal answer is no, we're not prepared for the rate of take up, regardless of whether that kind of trajectory starts in, say, this year or 2025 or beyond. Because once it does start taking off, the pace of change is incredible. One example is in the UK in June 2019, which you kind of is not even on this slide, they were at 2.2% of new vehicle sales. By December 2019, EVs made up 6.6%, and in December 2020, it made up 23.4% of new vehicle sales. So what does that mean? It means that in the space of 18 months, the UK, which is another right-hand drive market for us, which is relevant to us, grew more than 10 times in 18 months. There is no industry or market in the world that can deal with that. So when we think about designing buildings, we kind of go, all right, well, there aren't too many EVs on the road. Do we really think about that? And we say, we need to think about it because there is no world in the future where EVs aren't the majority of what we drive. And buildings that are being built today hopefully last 50 to 70 years. So we really need to be thinking about EVs because the rate of take up is going to be huge. Okay, I just want to go through the evolution of EV charging. So what I mean by that is what's been spec'd in buildings previously, what's been spec'd in buildings now. When I first started in this industry, maybe like 2013-ish, a lot of what was going into buildings were the stuff that's on the left-hand side, what we call dumb or standalone charging stations, if you're trying to be nice. And a lot of that got born because Tesla, when they entered the market, were giving charging stations for free to buildings. They said, we'll give you the charging station, and in some cases, they even paid for it, and we'll install it. But the problem with these charging stations is that they were dumb. So they were like a PowerPoint. There was, no stats, no billing, no utilization data, no access control, no load management, nothing, right? And it was just an introductory kind of like thing for the market. So sure, you can charge your cars, but not much else. Then, and this still happens today, we move into a world where there are all these startups in EV charging that think they're the next Apple, right? And they want to control the ecosystem. So they say, buy our chargers, buy our software, but our chargers only work with our own software and our software only work with our chargers because we're going to be the next Apple, right? The thing is, charging, it's not like smartphones. They're much more like smart meters. And so people don't interact with it like they do with smartphones. And from a building perspective, there are going to be some cases where proprietary solutions are okay. For example, JetCharger specifies some of our proprietary charging stations in really small developments, sub 20 car parks, and we're putting a charging station in every single car park. So because you're never going to be expanding beyond that, because you're not going to have another basement, for example, it doesn't matter if it's one ecosystem, you don't have to add additional charges on top of that. Now, because proprietary chargers lock you into an ecosystem, they tend to be a bit cheaper. It's not always the case, but sometimes you'll find that proprietary chargers are a bit cheaper because they lock you in for the long term. But even companies like Wallbox, who we stock, are moving away from that system to one that's open source. So when we say OCPP, what we mean by that is Open Charge Point Protocol. And so the EV charging market very early on came together and said, we're going to basically agree on a single language and standard. And they called that Open Charge Point Protocol. And 95% of the hardware and software that's in the market is OCPP compatible. So when you're designing buildings, it's really important that not so much the box, I call these charging stations boxes. It's probably a disservice to our suppliers, but they are just boxes. And you either doesn't matter what kind of brand you're putting in, it's more important that they're OCPP compatible. And then you look at other stuff like pricing, reliability, aesthetics, etc. But the first thing is to make sure they're open protocol, because charging is not a set and forget kind of thing, right? You're going to be adding to it over time. And so they must be open source, because you want any kind of charging station, and you might have 30 different brands in your basement, right? Your tenants might buy ones themselves. You want all of those brands of stations to be able to connect to any type of software, and you need any software platform to be able to manage any charger, right? Same thing. Then we basically have AC and DC charging. So the vast majority of what you're going to see in kind of like these built environments is probably going to be AC charging, because people tend to charge when they're at work or when it's overnight, and you stay there for a really long period of time. DC charging is for things that require a 1 hour or faster turnaround, essentially. It's kind of like a rule of thumb. So you put in DC charging, for example, in shared spaces in apartments, you put it into logistics hubs, you put it into all of that. So that's pretty kind of self-explanatory. You want DC charging when you want faster turnaround. You want AC charging where it's overnight or during the day over a long period of time. Okay. So that's kind of like hardware, and you can go into the weeds a little bit on that, but that's essentially an overview of hardware. An equally important topic is this concept of energy management, because you're not going to have most buildings enough electrical capacity, even greenfields, enough electrical capacity to service 100% of the car park when everyone's charging their cars. So you need this concept of energy management to make sure that whatever capacity you do have is spread between the charging stations. And so how does it work? It works pretty much exactly how you think, which is that when there aren't too many cars, they all charge at the full rate. At night, when cars start coming back from work and all the lifts are going and aircon and induction cooktops are on and all of that stuff, it basically lowers everyone's charge rate or queues people depending on the system, and then basically make sure that the charging doesn't take as much electricity. And then when everyone's gone to sleep, and there's less electricity being used by the building, the charge rate ramps up, and then all the vehicles are fully charged in the morning. There are a few systems in the market that can do this. So JetCharge has one thing called JetCharge Core, and basically it just makes sure that none of the circuit breakers trip, right? I won't go through this in too much detail, but essentially what you're looking for in an energy management system is, again, something that works with different types of chargers, that works with different types of software platforms. That's really important. And so how does it work? Basically, what it does is it dynamically analyzes how much capacity is available on each circuit, and then allocates that capacity to charging stations that are connected. I think that's like, this graph probably doesn't mean much at the moment without context. But what it is it's detecting excess solar being pumped into the grid. This is actually our office. And then if any vehicles were charging, it would take that excess solar and it would pump it back into the vehicles, as well as whatever else the vehicle requires. So this happens on a building by building level, precinct by precinct level. Even more than that, as we kind of go to the next step, which is essentially not only being able to charge when there's enough capacity, but also being able to discharge the vehicle when the building doesn't have enough capacity. This concept of what we call bi-directional charging. And that's going to happen probably in the next 4 to 5 years. We're currently working on some kind of fairly bleeding edge products, projects at the moment where we're taking electricity out of the vehicle to support the grid when the grid is under pressure. But in the next 5 years, a lot of vehicles are going to be able to do this. And what's going to happen is that when you start having fleets of vehicles in the building capable of bi-directional charging, they have the potential to be able to replace stationary storage. Except the developer hasn't had to pay for that, right? It's the individual tenants who pay for that, and you're utilizing their battery through a variety of different business models. And what it allows you to do is it allows you to meet site requirements in the same way a battery would, It's just something to keep in mind. And people use energy management for different reasons, right? So they basically say, you know, for some of our clients, it's essentially to make sure that they don't trip breakers. For some, it's to make sure that they keep their demand charges on the electricity side really low. And then others, for example, with bus depots that we're working on, is to make sure that the buses go out on time, but for the lowest possible cost. And so you kind of start needing energy management for different things. Then the last thing that we kind of touch on is this concept of how do you monitor the electricity that is going through these charging stations and bill for it. And without being too salesy about it, that's what we use ChargeFox for. There are other platforms on the market that you should look at that does similar things. It basically measures how much electricity is going through the charging station and then bills accordingly, either on credit card or through an actual bill. All of the charging stations that you specify into these buildings should have the capability, at least, of having billing requirements, because long term, no one's giving stuff away for free. Long term, everyone is going to want to recover at least the electricity cost. And this is already very established in the markets that we work with, the buildings that we work with, is that all the charging stations are connected, they're all OCPP compatible, and they're all connected to a platform like ChargeFox, which essentially allows you to have, you know, like a dashboard, shows you how much electricity is being used. And you can get this from different service providers. And then the last thing I'll talk about is on the concept of retrofits. There's a real, like within the EV charging world, there's a real kind of stigma around retrofits because it's seen as too hard, that you can't do whole buildings worth of charging if they've already been constructed. And it's something that we say you can do, you know, ranging from a single charging station in someone's own car space all the way through to whole of building fit outs. And there are a lot more brownfield buildings than greenfields. And so what you really, you can, with energy management, transform an entire existing building to one that caters for 100% penetration of electric vehicles. But it requires energy management, it requires good planning and some sophisticated kind of electricals. So, but retrofits are possible. So look, it's a pretty big topic. And there's a lot that goes into the design of an EV charging system. But I guess the overall message that I kind of want to send is that EVs are coming, and it doesn't really matter whether they're coming kind of this year, next year, or in 2025. When they do come, it will be at a rate that not many of us are prepared for, including us here at JetCharge. It's just going to be too fast. But they're all going to come. It's going to be a really important part of our buildings and really important for us to achieve our environmental goals as a country. And so I encourage you to start looking at it and designing for it. Okay.
Thanks, Tim. That was really interesting. Now, there are no questions yet. I'm just wondering whether there's going to be some coming through. So if anyone's got any questions for Tim while we've got him online, now is the time to ask them. So whereabouts are you based, Tim?
I'm in Melbourne, but we've got offices in Sydney and opening ones up in Brisbane and Perth.
And what sort of take-up are you finding in residential projects?
Every single resi project now has some form of EV charging in there, from the really high-end luxury ones where it's one for every single car park. So the ones where you're looking at, you know, for the downsizer market, high-end luxury, every car park has a charger, because that's going to be the first market that has EV charging, all the way through to like mass market resi ones. They will at least have shared charging, but provision, most importantly, provision for like a lot of the basement to have individual charging stations in car space, because that's essentially where you need to put it. You need to put the vast majority of charging stations in someone's own car space. Yeah,
okay. We have got some questions coming through. Lara has asked, how does it work with publicly available charging stations, e.g. whilst travelling regionally?
Yeah, so the public charging network across Australia is being built out pretty well. It's not going as fast as it should, but there are quite a few providers out there who are providing public charging. And it's not just the traditional kind of oil companies. Lots of people are installing charging infrastructure, including all the supermarkets, councils, etc. But the one thing to keep in mind is that as much as we think about public charging, especially going on road trips, because it's such a big part of our culture, 99% of our daily lives are spent in the cities or wherever we kind of spend our time. And in that kind of situation, like anywhere from 80 to 90% of charging is done privately. And in Australia, as opposed to anywhere else in the world, we have a high proportion of off-street parking, even for our high density like MDUs. And so it's important to design it into our car parks.
Okay. Now another question, how much space needs to be reserved for the core hardware, especially in a high-rise residential building?
It just goes next to the switchboard. Space is not going to be a constraint. It's a very small system. Yeah.
Peter has asked, what year do you think that EVs will outsell ICE cars?
So we're predicting anywhere between 25 to 35% of new vehicle sales, maybe even up to 50% by 2030, depending on government mandate. I think it's safe to say by about 2035, you'll start, even in Australia, we'll start to see EVs outstrip petrol. But one thing to keep in mind, guys, is that in 2025 to 2027, I'm going to give it that 2-year time band. When you walk into a dealership and want to purchase a vehicle, it's going to be cheaper or the same price to buy an electric vehicle. And that electric vehicle
2025.
And that electric vehicle will be like a third of the cost of fuel and half the cost to maintain. And for the 90% of us who purchase a vehicle to go from A to B rather than for any enthusiast purpose, you're going to go for the cheaper option. And if every single vehicle manufacturer is coming to you and saying, hey guys, the coolest thing to buy is the EV, there are going to be very few of us who start looking at the petrol option. And a lot of us lease vehicles, right? The leasing companies will start in about 23, 24 to start to take a very pessimistic view of residual values of petrol vehicles. So you're going to start seeing repayments on petrol vehicles start going up, and repayments on electric vehicles start coming down relative to where they are now. So even though I say it's going to be like 2030, 2035 before we see that crossover, the things that get set in motion is way before then. And I think you'll see a very quick step change. Yeah.
It's interesting. Okay. Michael has asked, where would be the optimal position for a household garage to install an EV charger?
So basically in a household garage, I can give you all the specs. It's like 1.5 meters off the ground. But essentially, when you're specing a residential garage, I would recommend specifying basically a circuit from the switchboard to an isolator. And then either, if you include a charging station, great, but at least to an isolator. So then the owner only has to connect the charging station to that isolator. But it doesn't matter whether you put it on the left wall or the right wall, but put it on the side rather than at the back, essentially.
Okay, that's good to know. Dale asks, Tim, have you been speaking to the E-team at ABCB for class 2 to 9 building refits?
Nope. And I can tell you I haven't been speaking with them because I probably missed most of what that sentence meant. So
Building Codes Board, I don't know what the E-team is. Class 2 to 9 is commercial building refits.
No, so I haven't been speaking with those guys, but happy to do so if you think it'd be of value.
Michael has asked or says, thank you. We hear about renewable energy projects coming online and older coal-fired stations closing down now or in the future. Do you know if there's a net gain overall in electricity production? i.e., are we going to be able to cater for future demand?
The answer is yes, we'll be able to cater for future demand. And the cool thing about electricity is that you're going to get, and your clients are going to get, more and more market signals as to when best to charge. And people are going to have choice as to when they charge and how much they pay for electricity. But yes, there will be enough capacity to meet demand.
Okay. Christy has asked, do you think the government tax on EV per kilometre will go through, assuming it hasn't been passed yet?
It's going to be, I think you're talking about the Victorian road user charge. So we're finding it very hard because it'll be the first jurisdiction in a developed country to put a tax on EVs rather than incentivizing them. So we're finding it very hard. Will it go through? Not sure. It's been introduced into Parliament pretty soon. So we'll see what happens. But I think if you look at the greater context of what's happening globally on the race to electric vehicles, it's a pretty short-sighted move by the Victorian government, especially a government that prides itself on its renewable energy credentials. we find it pretty disappointing. But suffice to say, we're trying to work with them through it, and hopefully we'll come to a good outcome.
Okay. Peter's made a comment. He's predicting nearly 100% take up of EV vehicles by 2030.
Awesome. You should come work for me.
There's another question. What is the average cost to set up a charging station for a residential home?
For a residential home, about 2,000 installs. Yep.
Okay. So Dale's just clarifying the E-team is the energy efficiency team.
Great.
Yes, it would be good to speak with them. They are investigating EV charging retrofits at the moment.
If, I don't know, Jennifer, whether you can organise me to contact them, but that'd be really great. Yep.
Arrange for you to connect through to them. Michael has said Pepper Finance offering 3% finance for Teslas.
Yes.
Now, Lisa has asked, many residential dwellings have limited on-site parking. How will on-street overnight parking be able to charge?
Yeah, so we're working with councils through that. It's a very interesting problem, but essentially the answer is going to be through a partnership with the councils and also with the network operators who own the power poles. So we're going to be putting infrastructure on the poles.
Okay, there's lots of questions coming through. I'm going to try and keep up because there's some in the chat box. I'm just going to go there for a minute.
Sure.
Is there an Australian standard that the installations need to meet?
Yeah, so all the installations need to meet AS3000 wiring rules.
We've heard that bidirectional batteries were available overseas, just not here in Australia yet.
It is available here in Australia through the Nissan Leaf and Mitsubishi Outlander plug-in hybrids. It's the charging stations that are not currently available globally. Okay. Outside of trials. Our first one is currently being certified for the relevant standard and should be ready by the middle of the year, which will be the first one on the market.
Damon has asked, what percentage of electric charging stations are you putting into commercial buildings?
That's a really good question. It varies a lot per commercial building. What we generally recommend is to say that you need to allow enough maximum capacity for 20% of vehicles to charge at once. But for example, we just did Collins Arch in Melbourne. That was with Multiplex and C-Bus. That was 56, I think, charging stations in the commercial space. But yeah, it's actually been driven a lot by the professional services firms who have aggressive global targets on environmental impact. And because most of their environment, CO2, kind of comes from transport, they are looking at buildings with EV charging. So it's going to be a mainstay for anyone looking at a new office building. Yeah.
Okay. At what point will this technology be viable for individual dwellings, which I'm assuming is now?
Well, EV charging today is. For bidirectional, it's probably going to be it's going to be available across the board on vehicles around about 2025. So when you go into a dealer and you purchase a vehicle and that vehicle is an electric, chances are it's going to be capable of bidirectional charging. It's just a question of whether you install the relevant charger to take advantage of that. Almost everyone will, because it essentially means like a huge battery pack that's capable of powering your house for 3 days. And so you could go down to your local Woolies, do your shopping, charge your car up to full, and then go home and power your house for 3 days for free. So I think a lot of people will do that.
Yeah. What type of provision are you talking about? Is it a 32 amp single phase supply or do you need triple phase?
No, so you don't need three phase. You only need single phase for EV charging in residential environments. In single homes, 32 amps is more than enough. In fact, going down to 20 to 25 is also okay. In multi-unit dwellings, we also recommend single phase for in-car space charging because three phase requires 5-pole kind of circuit breakers and RCDs, and it's going to take up too much space. So generally single phase is more than adequate.
Okay. I'm going to keep pushing through some of these questions because there's quite a few.
Sure.
Is there a combined AC-DC charging port or are they separate units always?
So CCS2, which is the DC charging standard in vehicles, has the AC portion at the top, 2 DC pins at the bottom, so that's combined. Japanese vehicles use a standard called CHAdeMO for fast charging, which is separate to the AC side. But for most vehicles on the road, they use CCS.
Okay. Can you send us a specification and dimensioning for installations?
I don't know who asked that, but sure, if you, I'm sure Jennifer will give out.
George, I can't see George's
I'm sure
last
Jennifer
name.
will publish my contact details. Feel free to contact me. You can look me up on LinkedIn.
Tim, what do you think, and this is, I'm not sure who this one's coming from either. Tim, what do you think of the new standard in SA to regulate power use in the home and restrict feed in to ease the stress on the grid?
I think it's inevitable. I know there's a lot of controversial opinions on it, but it's inevitable, and it's also a really good reason to become more and more self-reliant. And we should always be connected to the grid and support it. But the fact that our vehicles that we purchase in the future will be capable of supporting our home energy needs as well, combined with solar, means that these decisions will probably impact on a lot of users less and less.
How many charging stations should we allocate now for 100 cars?
Probably 20.
Okay. Brendan asks, what tax changes do you anticipate given the likely revenue drop in fuel excise?
If it's one thing I have faith in, is that the government will be able to find alternative ways to tax us. And fuel excise has been dropping for a really long time, not only because of EVs, but also because of more efficient engines and the introduction of hybrids. So it'll probably move to a road user charge, which is where the rest of the world is going. Our only problem with the one in Victoria is that it doesn't apply to any vehicles other than EVs, and therefore it's not a road user charge, it's a tax on EVs. And so I think as we move away from fuel excise, we'll move to a road user charge for all vehicles to replace the revenue.
Roland, hi Roland, has asked, what rating does the isolator need to be per single vehicle charge system?
We generally prefer 40 amps.
A few more questions and then we're going to have to move on to our next question.
Sure.
But Lisa has asked, many residential dwellings have limited on-site parking. How will, oh no, we've asked that one.
Yep.
Damien has said, should I buy an electric car now or wait 2 to 3 years? They seem a bit pricey and a little bit crappy at the moment.
Okay, so my suggestion is to go and drive them, and if you don't like the car, don't buy it.
Peter has said he charges his i3 from a standard power point.
Yep, a lot of people do charge from a single power point, which is actually enough for a lot of people. As the battery packs get bigger and bigger, like goes up to 70, 80, 100 kilowatt hours, that's when you'll start probably needing a charging station at home.
Richard has said, do we need to provide 3-phase power? But we've already answered that one. Michael says, is any company working on a portable EV charger for long distance remote travel?
No.
So Lara has asked, does bidirectional charging mean you would have a power source in the case of the grid being out?
Yes.
Esther has asked, would a residential system require significant hardware upgrade to enable utilisation of bidirectional charging?
No. It requires no upgrades compared to a normal charging station.
Okay. I think that is all the questions I need.
Okay, cool.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was
no problem.
interesting. So if anyone has got any more questions, please let me know and I'll make sure that we get them answered.
Cool. Thanks, everyone. See you later. Bye.
I'm going to hand over now for our next presentation, which is Sustainable Buildings, the New Paradigm for Managing Our Cities, and it's presented by Michael Smith from Kingspan. So imagine if we changed the design of every building so that it was energy and water efficient, managed stormwater and cooled our heat waves. Recent research has shown that these policies have a non-linear benefit that changes the whole city. This is the science of distributed solutions rather than central infrastructure and big data research based on billions of interactions at the lot level across the whole city. Using basics, rainwater harvesting and Greater Sydney as the case study shows that how we design each building on a lot could be the key to cities of the future. So I can see Michael ready to go. Michael is the Technical and Sustainability Manager at Kingspan Water and Energy. Welcome, Michael.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Background and a professional experience in rainwater harvesting, water efficiency, natural resource management and strategic and statutory. Michael believes that cities are integrated environmental, social and economic systems and all our actions should improve how urban systems perform. Michael has an honours degree in urban planning, including majors in economics and transport engineering and postgraduate qualifications in urban design. He is the Deputy Chair of Rainwater Harvesting Australia and the Co-Chair of the AWA Water Efficiency Specialist Network. Welcome, Michael.
Thank you, Jennifer.
I am going to hand over to you now. Thank you.
No worries. I'm going to jump straight into sharing the screen. let me know if that's worked. Is that going, Jennifer?
Yes, that is fine. It just needs to be flipped over to full screen.
Is that better?
Yes, I think we can still actually just see the preview.
Okay. Hang on, let me try that again then. I'm on twin screens here and it gets a little bit confusing as to which one I should be running. Is that better?
Can't see it yet. There we go. Perfect.
Great. All right. I wanted to talk about sustainable buildings and a different way of thinking about how we manage our cities. So I'm using water as a little bit of an example. And this first diagram actually goes back to Edwin Chadwick, 1843, and it's still very much how we plan water use in our cities. So the idea is you find somewhere out in the bush with a big dam, you bring water into the city through pipes, then you build a whole lot more pipes, you put it through a sewage treatment plant and you get rid of it. It's a linear system, and it's very much based around the idea of the city as a unit. So the city is what you're supplying. So up in Queensland, we use 450 gigalitres of water a year. And so you need dams and treatment plants that can supply 450 gigalitres, and then you need sewage treatment plants that can treat about 75% of that, and then send them out to the ocean. And that's how we think about cities in all sorts of ways, to some extent energy and transport and a whole lot of other things. Some of the things that kind of thinking doesn't capture, and this is just an example, but it's to sort of show what that linear in-out system doesn't think about. This is a little diagram comparing a natural forest with an urban area. So on the left-hand side with the natural forest, you have rain. Nearly half of the rain that's falling is actually absorbed by the trees, goes down into the soil and becomes part of the water table, and that maintains a consistent level of water in the creek. Nearly half of the rain that's falling evaporates and evapotranspirates from the plants, and that cools down that whole forest and keeps things cool. On the city side, those systems aren't working. So because you've got a lot of impermeable surfaces, only about 10% of the water is going down into the ground, and only about 10% of the water is being held in the landscape and is evaporating and cooling the city. And the other 80%, when it rains, is rushing down into our creeks and scouring our creeks out and making them very unpleasant places to live. But when it's not raining, because there's so little ground flow, you've got a situation that the creeks are often hardly running at all. So those are some of the things that you don't capture when you consider a linear pattern. This is the other paradigm. This is another way of looking at how our cities can work. And instead of the city being at the center of this diagram, buildings at the center of this diagram. And what we're suggesting is that if you make relatively minor design changes to your buildings, you can reduce how much water is going into them, how much rainwater harvesting you might need to do. You can harvest the rain that falls on the roof and put that back into the building. You can use your buildings and the water in them to support lots of green spaces and thereby cool down the cities. You can manage the way the stormwater is running off those buildings to change the whole stormwater pattern across the city. The way you change the way you use the water in those buildings affects your sewage. And then the other thing I wanted to show is that putting the building at the centre also provides an opportunity for a more circular approach, so that you can see that by incorporating some natural systems and thinking about natural systems in our building management, it's a circular system and it all becomes part of broader systems of desalination and recycling and rainwater and stormwater harvesting, but also the natural water cycle. So just to go back to that first diagram where I talked about the difference between natural systems and urban systems, if you can imagine putting a house on the left-hand side and actually getting that building to replicate or copy what's happening in nature, you can have a building on the left-hand side which captures 80% of the water that's landing on its roof, and create spaces where that water can permeate down into the water table, and you get higher water tables and more consistent stream flows, but also where more of that water is captured and used to maintain green spaces around it. So you can start to replicate that 40% transpiration and evaporation and cool down those cities. So this stuff has been around for a while. What's really interesting is some work that Peter Coombs has done, looking at how these small design changes can impact on the whole city. And it's quite difficult to explain about big data and systems frameworks. So I've used an example which is by no means perfect, but I think it sort of gives you an opportunity to see how it's a different way of thinking and a different scale of thinking. So I've used traffic as an example, and traffic and transport are not part of the modelling work that Peter does generally, but as an example, when we look at a city, we might, for example, say that there are 7 vehicle movements every day for every dwelling. So 100,000 dwellings will give you 700,000 vehicle movements moving around the city. And that's looking at the whole city and looking at traffic movements right across that. Using new technology and using the kind of thinking that Google uses, you can use what they call big data, which is very detailed data at very small time frames. And Google uses the actual data about where cars are to map traffic. So it's using thousands, millions, tens of millions of data units to create a model of how the city is moving and how transport's happening. And not only a model of how many movements there are, but because it's a live system, you're also getting feedback from the system, so that when you get higher points of traffic use, the traffic around that starts to adapt, and it goes, no, I don't think I'll go down there, there's too much traffic. It starts to take different options. So you get a dynamic feedback within the system. That's not a bad metaphor for the kind of work that Peter Coombs is doing. So again, just dropping back to that diagram before, traditionally we've looked at the city and water moving in and water moving out. What Coombs has done has looked at water flows, and not just drinking water, but water flows for utility flows for water and the sewage, the sewage that's coming out, because there's obviously a really close connection between those two, but also the stormwater. And Peter's used data at 6-minute intervals based on the detailed behaviour of both households and the utility network. So, we tend to think of all the buildings in the city being roughly the same for modelling purposes. Peter said, well, no, that's not right. So a townhouse or an apartment unit or a separate house will use water very differently, and the number of people in the house will change, and the income that they've got and all those sorts of things. And then they're influenced by the weather. So how we use water is actually influenced quite a lot by whether or not it's raining, whether or not we're in drought, or whether we perceive that we're in surplus for water. So he's modelled those sorts of things, and he's done that at those 6-minute time sequences for over 100 years of climate data. That's created, and a digital twin's not a bad metaphor for that. He's created a model of the city, and having that model, we can then start to model different scenarios and say, well, what would happen if we did have a rainwater tank on every building? What would happen if we only used desalination? What would happen if we built big recycling plants everywhere? What's happening now in terms of water getting from treatment stations to the house and to the hey guys, damn. Yeah, what would happen if we modelled those things and we can actually measure what the benefits of those things are. So we used BASIX in Sydney, in Greater Sydney, to say, well, what would happen if we didn't have BASIX? What kind of differences will we see? And we've done a retrospective, what would happen between 2004 and now in terms of what the cost would have been, but also what are the likely benefits of BASIX out to 2050. So we worked out there was around about a saving of $3 billion in water and sewage costs, a bit over just under $1.5 billion in stormwater costs, $2 billion in stormwater nutrient costs, and total benefits of around $5.3 billion. So you might say, well, given those kind of benefits, why are we not going down that track? And part of the answer, it's not the whole answer, is part of the answer is the way we think, and we've traditionally engineered our cities, and also the business models we've put up have been very much about recognising infrastructure and basing the way we pay for water on that infrastructure, rather than on looking for greater efficiencies and those kind of opportunities. So I wanted to just talk a little bit about better buildings and maybe some thinking about how we can shift our cities to changing the design of the buildings so that the whole city works better, why that's not happening and how that might happen. So one of the things I think is really important is that we need to recognise that private business, and I work for a manufacturer, we make rainwater tanks. Businesses are about having profit, and that's what they're good at. You know, we're good at building rainwater tanks. We can do it very efficiently. We can build a really good quality product. We put it out there, and we expect to make a margin on that. That's our business. We and most businesses are not necessarily all that well aware of what the environmental impacts are in terms of stormwater and water and the cost of treatment plants and polluting effects and what the community needs, and we think that's the role of government. So we think it's really important that we say, okay, government should be stepping in and making the rules for sustainable buildings, and those rules should definitely reflect local conditions, but there shouldn't be a lot of discretion in that, because that's not fair to businesses. They should know what the rules are, and my experience of most designers is that it's better if you know what the rules are up front, rather than be in a position where you're going to have to negotiate, because that takes a lot longer and there's a lot less certainty and there's a lot less business certainty in that. And then the role of the community is to elect decision makers who can make a good decision on our part. So, and here's a bit of speculation, and I've worked in this industry for a long time, so it covers a few different areas, but there's some thinking here about, well, what might more sustainable buildings look like? And I'd be suggesting that they might actually be a bit taller than they are now, but there'd be a maximum. So there is a community expectation about how high buildings are going to go in suburban residential areas, and that might be 4 stories. And again, it's up to the government to make these rules, but as an example, but site coverage might drop back to 50%. So higher buildings, but with much smaller footprints. And of that, 40% of the site might be permeable, so you get the groundwater infiltration and the stormwater management we talked about. And 30% of the site might be suitable for things like large canopy trees, so we get that urban cooling. And also the very strong public perceptions we have that greener spaces are more livable, they're better for our mental health, they're more attractive, they have higher real estate values, a whole lot of stuff that goes with that. In terms of energy, water and stormwater, we might say that 50% of the energy needs should be met on site. 50% of the water needs might be met on site, so much more resilient buildings that can cope with a whole lot of changes around them, because I think we're starting to realise that there's a lot of unpredictability in both our climate and our society. Heating and cooling energy costs not to exceed 39 megajoules per metre squared per annum. That's the 6-star NatHERS rating for Sydney, and we think that that's probably a good guide for the whole country. And then a 50% reduction in the annual average stormwater runoff volume. So that's thinking about stormwater very much in terms of volume rather than peak flows, because we find if you manage volume, then you tend to manage your peak flows and your nutrients really well. And then lastly, waste, which is, again, a bit of an extension, but it's an area that I've had some experience in. And, what would happen if we decided that we would stop dumping our waste into landfill? What would happen if we said that the waste that's coming out of our buildings would either be reduced, reused or recycled? And if it had to be destroyed, then it would be destroyed, but at a cost that reflected the impact on the environment. So I said we talked about rainwater harvesting, and I know many of you do rainwater harvesting, and we are really impressed by the level of interest from both the community and in professional circles. I just very briefly, and there's a link at the end of the presentation to this, wanted to talk about the residential design specification for rainwater harvesting. So this is a national guide. So obviously the local controls that may change this in different places, but it's a very simple 12-page guide that just talks about the roof, the ways of collecting rainwater, the ways of treating and managing rainwater, the tank and the pump and the bypass systems, and tries to put all that together and say, well, this is what over a long period of time we, and Professor Coombs has done a lot of background work in this area, think is the right way to go. So how am I doing for time, Jennifer?
You are doing fine for time, Michael. There's a couple of questions. Do you want me to ask now, or do you want to save them for the end?
Oh, look, I'll just very quickly go through the case studies.
Yep.
And I'm really just going to touch on them, and then I can just go fully fledged on whatever questions.
No worries at all.
Okay, so this is a nice little Australian example. It's a library, and the challenge was to try and combine a good design and a good looking design with reduced energy consumption and water consumption strategies. We provided a series of water tanks which we felt met the design aesthetic, or the designers felt met the design aesthetic really well, but also provided really practical benefits in terms of suitable water for flushing the toilets on the site, reducing mains water usage, and improving the stormwater performance of the site. This is a Northern Ireland, so Kingspan is a multinational building materials company, of which we're a very small part. And this was around looking at a new library and a very large roof area, and saying, well, how can we make this whole building work more sustainably, work better with natural systems, and reduce environmental impacts. And so they harvest 2.6 million litres, which is a really decent amount. Mind you, they have very decent rainfall as well, and they provide that for toilets and a range of internal uses and some landscaping. Pascoe Vale, so this is for our Melbourne friends. This is just a set of apartments that's been built there. These are quite small rainwater tanks, so 1,500 litre tanks, and they're mostly in there. In fact, there's obviously a benefit for rainwater use, but they're mostly in there to ameliorate the stormwater effect. So some of that stuff I was talking about before, in terms of large flat concrete areas which are just generating enormous amounts of runoff and having a really permanent deleterious effect on the local waterways around there. So Moonee Ponds Creek, Mary Creek, those places. 75% of the roof catchment is harvested, which has been a dramatic reduction in mains water demand and also the runoff. So there's two links there. One is the alternate strategy for Greater Sydney, which provides the details of the work that Coombs has done about how using a system like BASIX, and I probably should just very quickly say that the great thing about BASIX is it ties energy and water management into our development process. So when you have a development boom, you get a energy and water management boom at the same time, because it's built into the buildings, and it's a very clever system. And I don't think there's enough recognition about the benefits that have been there from it. It could do with some updating, but we think that if you look at the hard numbers on it, it's been really successful. And then, as I mentioned, there's a quick reference to the design specification there. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much, Michael. That was really interesting. I'm just going to ask a few of the questions that have come in. So there's a question.
I should also apologise. I have a very quiet office, and it was just a little bit of bad luck that a group of quite loud, I don't know how much sound bled through, but a group of people came in, so my apologies for that.
I didn't hear any of it, so
good.
I'm sure it all came through fine. There's actually a question here that's been posed from your office for us to think about.
Oh, yeah.
Which is what comes to mind when we say efficient water management. How important is it to building design? So that's something for us to think about. So I don't know whether people want to make some comments in the chat box, and maybe that will start some discussion. We haven't got huge amounts of time, but interesting to see what people's thoughts are. So Mark has asked, has BASIX given an indication of when and if they will increase the target from 40% to 50%?
Not that I've heard. The most recent news we have is that they're intending to include BASIX in the new design and place state environmental planning policy, but the indications are in that it'll be shifted across into the new SEP in much the same form as it is now. There is a separate call, I think, under the New South Wales Water Strategy to review BASIX, but I haven't heard a timeline to bring in the new targets. I know that work was done, but a review was carried out about 2 years ago, but I don't know when the results of that are going to come through, or whether that'll be a separate review process.
Okay, thank you. Right. How are you tackling the issue of retrofit on existing buildings, and what incentives are there from the government for encouraging or funding retrofit?
Really good question. And one of the good things about BASIX has been that, as many of you would be aware, it includes, I think, major renovations, which are 30% of the floor space. So that picks up some of the retrofits. There's just starting to be a conversation amongst the town planners. I haven't heard amongst the building designers so much about saying, some of the urban challenges we face are so great, including the stormwater challenges and probably the heat wave challenges, that we might need to be much more serious about retrofitting. But at the moment, and particularly given that we've been in a housing boom for some time now, I think there's also a quite correct interpretation that, you know, we should start by getting the new buildings that we're building right, so that they're right for the next 50 and 100 years. That's the first priority. And once we've got those things sorted, then maybe the second priority is the retrofitting. But it's a good question.
Okay. Nicolay has asked, hello, Michael, what is the name of the Coombs analysis paper?
Yeah, I provided the reference there. It's the alternate water strategy, I think, for Greater Sydney. It's in the link. We've actually provided a copy of the document, and there's a short video where we talk about the highlights of the findings. But Coombs has published on a great deal of work. Coombs and Barry were the winners of the 2019 Engineering Australia hydrology paper on looking at the systems framework, and a really interesting discussion about saying we shouldn't be using averages to drive discussions about how cities work. Averages are not representative of what's going to happen, and it's why we're constantly surprised by things like droughts and floods. Thank you.
And there was a question about the link. So yes, I think Sarah Jane will put a link in the chat box for that. Ashley has said, in Perth, we have a Mediterranean climate, so rainfall in only a few months of the year, cheap water costs and decreasing block sizes. What do you think the future of rainwater harvesting is for single houses in places like Perth?
Yeah, again, a really good question. Perth is in a really interesting situation because the drainage is superb. It's basically built on sand. So some of the stormwater challenges which are really driving rainwater harvesting in other cities are less so in Perth. Having said that, Perth is in an extremely dry climate, and in fact, it's not so much the rainfall that's declined, but it seems to be the runoff that's declined. So I think the water challenges for Perth are actually really serious, and things like desalination, which, let's face it, seem to work pretty well in Perth, come with a very high energy cost. So there's a balance there that I think we're still working out. I think one thing that would be really important, not just for Perth but for everywhere, is if the way we pay for water reflected the actual costs, because as I sort of alluded to earlier, the way we pay for water at the moment reflects the costs of infrastructure, and it's not a great incentive to be more efficient, and it doesn't reflect the all of the operational costs. So we have this idea that there's a postage stamp for water. You pay the same for water in the centre as you do on the edges, and that's okay. That's a policy decision. But with that has been an assumption that we also have postage stamp costs, that it costs the same to provide water in the centre or right next to a treatment plant as it does at the top of the Blue Mountains or the nearest mountain range. That's obviously not the case. It might be 10 times as much to provide water up there, and that means that we should be looking at a different balance of a central infrastructure supply and a distributed design solution in the buildings.
That leads into Michael's question. Do water usage charges increase the more you use? I know that gas charges in New South Wales get cheaper the more you use. Can government encourage change by increasing tariffs the more we use and thus rewarding conservation?
Absolutely. So that is a really major issue with the way we charge for water. There's a very high proportion of fixed costs and a much smaller proportion of variable charges. And what that means is you pay a great big chunk for the water before you use any. So in fact, the more water you use, the less proportional amount you're paying. You're still paying more overall, but someone who's very efficient with their water might be paying $3-4 a kilolitre or $6 a kilolitre, and someone who's using a great deal of water is only paying $3 a kilolitre. So that person who's using more water is still paying more, but per kilolitre they're paying less. So it's a really good question. The way the tariffs are structured doesn't actually encourage us to be more efficient with water.
Okay. Before we finish up, have you got a poll that you're wanting to post from your end?
Yeah, so this is an area that Kingspan's really interested in. Obviously, we believe that these design solutions can make a really big difference. But we're also conscious that we need better data about the impact of the design solution. So obviously we have an interest in rainwater harvesting. We're interested in this group and your views about a device or an app that would provide, you know, online data and historical data, so over the last year, about how much rainwater you'd harvested, how much had been used in the house, how much stormwater volume had been taken out of stormwater systems. Whether that's something that you think you as designers and your customers would be interested in. So it's a yes/no question, and we'd be very interested in your views.
Okay, well, that's up on everyone's screens now. So if you can answer that, and we'll be interested to see what the results are. And I think that is it for the questions, unless I've missed any. That was a really interesting presentation. Thank you, Michael, and thank you, Lisa.
Thank you, Jennifer, and thanks, Lisa.
So Sarah Jane, for while we're waiting, there we are, there's the poll results. So that's a resounding yes.
Great.
There's a lot of interest in such. All right. Very good. All right, well, I'm going to wrap things up now for everyone that has to leave. There's no QR code on the screen. Sarah Jane is going to email out certificates and we'll send something out tomorrow for the QR code. So thank you very much to both Tim and Michael for the presentations today. There was a lot of really interesting content in that and some good questions. So thank you very much. The next online chapter meeting will be Tuesday, the 4th of May at 1 p.m. Keep an eye out for the registration email and we'll look forward to seeing you all then. Thanks very much for joining us. Bye. For those of you who are still online, there is actually a QR code that's just come through. So that's on the screen now. If you can't access it, there will be one emailed through. All right, bye for now.